Recently, I did a video on why leftists and liberals are hypocrites for having kids, and in this video, I want to turn my attention to conservatives and why they are hypocrites for having children and opposing antinatalism. In my previous video, I said about how after being antinatalist for a few years, you tend to see groups in society with values that you think would kind of align with an antinatalist conclusion, and yet they don't draw one and they actually go against antinatalism. Now, conservatives are the group that are maybe one of the harder ones to align with antinatalism because they tend to champion things like family values and tradition. And obviously, for something to be a tradition, you tend to need for it to transmit across the generations, i.e., you need generations. But there are at least some ways and some of the values that conservatives hold that do have tension with the idea of reproduction and do align in some way with antinatalism. So let's have a look at those. The first is this idea of taking personal responsibility for one's actions and the consequences of one's actions. Now, what conservatives will tend to say is that liberals or leftists tend to explain away people's actions through appealing to social forces and systems that have an influence on the individual. And in so doing, you kind of explain away the responsibility that someone has for their actions as well. So an individual might take an action, but the responsibility and the blame for that action isn't necessarily put at least wholly on the individual because of these systems and wider influences on that person. But conservatives would tend to put more emphasis on the responsibility that that individual has. But what stands in stark contrast with that when it comes to reproduction and antinatalism are two things. The first can't be laid at the feet of every conservative because not every conservative would condone this. This tends to be the more religious types of conservatives, and that is this prudishness or this rejection of responsible use of contraception when it comes to family planning. You will tend to get some conservatives that oppose in whole the use of contraception, or at least a lot of uses of contraception, when that itself is extremely irresponsible, because you will then be leading to circumstances where children are born into existence because people are having unprotected sex, into circumstances which really aren't conducive to their well-being. The second aspect of personal responsibility that I wanted to highlight on, and I feel like this is a more fundamental one and actually does apply to pretty much all conservatives, is this idea of not taking personal responsibility for the consequence of your actions when it comes to procreation. So when it comes to procreation, we tend to be much more permissive in the harm that we will allow to impose on others than we would in other circumstances. And there's no personal responsibility taken by and large by people, not just conservatives, but people in general, for the harm that we put on children when we create them. When you create a child into existence, you are manufacturing in them vulnerability to all of the bad things that can happen in life. You're guaranteeing them suffering and you're guaranteeing them death as well. I'm not saying that's every part of existence. There can be positive aspects once you exist, but the negative consequences that our actions have for others are the things that really need to be morally taken into account when we're considering personal responsibility. And there just seems to be a complete lack of it when it comes to conservatives and procreation. Conservatives can, when someone is in bad circumstances or they've made a decision that results in bad consequences for themselves, lay the blame at the individual or put it down to the fact that there are unfortunate circumstances in life that we have to deal with, not recognizing the personal responsibility that not just that individual has, but the parents that created them have as well, including conservative parents. When you create someone into existence, of course they have autonomy to make their own decisions, but you put them into the circumstances of vulnerability in the first place where they could make decisions that would be negative for themselves. And there's responsibility at the feet of the creator, not just the created. But this is completely ignored by conservatives when it comes to the ethics of reproduction. If someone gets into financial debt, this is laid at the feet of the individual who got into that debt. It's seen as a form of personal responsibility. But when someone has been created and they are in unfortunate circumstances, whether that is out of their own creation or not, the responsibility of the person who created them in the first place is just not recognized at all. And this is a failing in general of people's approach to procreative ethics, but specifically also conservatives, because they emphasize personal responsibility so much. The second aspect of why conservatives are hypocrites for having kids is on the topic of abortion. Now, conservatives tend to take a pro-life or anti-abortion stance on the topic of abortion, and this is generally because they see life as being sacred and the unborn child as being innocent, and so they want to protect this life from the malicious actions of a mother who is carrying that child, or some other person who may be coercing the mother into getting an abortion. And from a conservative point of view, you can see this as almost a virtuous thing to do. You are trying to protect the innocent in the eyes of the conservative. And yet there's no recognition for the fact that creating someone in the first place is creating an innocent being into a state of vulnerability where they can be harmed. There seems to be a tension here in that conservatives care so much about unborn children that they are willing to pray and argue and protest against abortion, but they won't do the one and only thing that can guarantee no harm coming to innocent and sacred beings, which is not creating them in the first place. Another couple of things to say are on the topic of minorities in society. I am by no means saying that all conservatives are against minorities in some way, but it does tend to be more conservative cultures where minorities like gay people or trans people are less welcomed and more discriminated against. And there is an irony here because from the conservative point of view, these people are not existing or acting in a way that is in accordance with dignity or morality or however they might view it. And yet the only reason that people who are gay or people who are trans exist is because people procreate in the first place, and a subset of those people will be gay or trans. This is to say nothing negative about anyone who is gay or trans. Those people should be seen as equal just like anyone else. But within the mind of the conservative who has these discriminatory views, there is a tension here and a hypocrisy. And another thing to say is that more recently, conservatives have really taken up the mantle of championing protecting children, especially against grooming and sexual predators like pedophiles. And the irony here is that you'll hear slogans from conservatives like protect our children or save our children, and yet they're creating these very children into a world where they are, one, vulnerable in general to the harms of life. And why should a child be protected against the harms of grooming and sexual predation, but not against all the other forms of harm? So there's a hypocrisy there. But also, you're creating children into a world where there is sexual predation and there is grooming, and they will be potential victims of that. In fact, many children are victims of that, and the only reason they exist to be victims of those things is because their parents, often who will be conservatives, have created them in the first place. And a final thing to say, which is less a serious point and more just a sort of funny observation, is that conservatives will often tend to be more anti-immigration, saying there should be no immigration into a country or a region, or that there should be very limited immigration into a country because these are people coming from outside, they are not part of the existing culture, and they could be countercultural in some way and cause discord. And it's just funny that often conservatives will take this position, and yet what will they do when they procreate? They will bring new beings into the country who were not there before. They are foreign to the country, and often what do young people do? They are countercultural and often go against the norms of the day, often pissing conservatives off. You will actually often hear conservatives complain about the younger generations. They just don't get as much shit as immigrants do. But like I said, that's more a tongue-in-cheek one. Let me know if you can think of any more ways that conservatives are hypocrites for having kids and ways that they are hypocrites for rejecting antinatalism. Put that in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.